Time goes by, years and decades. She comes, she goes, but her story remains so. She is you, I, and the others. She belongs to herself and not another. She is whole, complete, and absolute, for she is resolute.
Hello and welcome to She Is Resolute. I'm your host Suvarna, and our endeavor on this show is to showcase conversations of grit and growth for the determined modern woman willing to take complete ownership of her life and her mindset. Our attempt is to bring to the fore actionable information on personal development through discussions with experts and personalities who have, in one way or another, proven that they too are resolute. So enjoy the episode and please do like, share, and subscribe.
We live in a world where there is a persistent skewed narrative of what the right diet is, or what a body or what a healthy body should visually look like. And these ideals are often unattainable, unrealistic, and doctored, leaving most people insecure and bitter. Thankfully, there are experts who provide the much needed voice of reason to put things into perspective. One such expert who's joining us today is Dr. Alexis Conason, a licensed psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist supervisor based in New York City, who has over a decade of experience treating people struggling with binge eating, disordered eating, and body image concerns. Passionate about mindful eating and a weight inclusive approach to health, Dr. Alexis founded the Anti Diet Plan program in 2018, which is a unique blend of psychological, mindfulness, and cultural change strategies to help one get unstuck from old patterns of dieting and learn a new holistic way of eating and relating to the world. She has helped hundreds of people break free from the diet, binge, self hatred cycle. And with her new book, The Diet Free Revolution, 10 Steps to Free Yourself from the Diet Cycle with Mindful Eating and Radical Self Acceptance, she has reached out to thousands more and helped them develop a healthy relationship with food and eating. We are truly thrilled to have with us today Dr. Alexis Conason. Welcome to She Is Resolute.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to dive right into the questions because I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. This is a subject matter that I'm personally interested in, so I'm so eager to learn from you today. We live in a world where there is a persistent skewed narrative of what the right diet is, or what a body or what a healthy body should visually look like. And these ideals are often unattainable, unrealistic, and doctored, leaving most people insecure and bitter. Thankfully, there are experts who provide the much needed voice of reason to put things into perspective. One such expert who's joining us today is Dr. Alexis Conason, a licensed psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist supervisor based in New York City, who has over a decade of experience treating people struggling with binge eating, disordered eating, and body image concerns. Passionate about mindful eating and a weight inclusive approach to health, Dr. Alexis founded the Anti Diet Plan program in 2018, which is a unique blend of psychological, mindfulness, and cultural change strategies to help one get unstuck from old patterns of dieting and learn a new holistic way of eating and relating to the world. She has helped hundreds of people break free from the diet, binge, self hatred cycle. And with her new book, The Diet Free Revolution, 10 Steps to Free Yourself from the Diet Cycle with Mindful Eating and Radical Self Acceptance, she has reached out to thousands more and helped them develop a healthy relationship with food and eating. We are truly thrilled to have with us today Dr. Alexis Conason. Welcome to She Is Resolute.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to dive right into the questions because I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. This is a subject matter that I'm personally interested in, so I'm so eager to learn from you today. So in your book, The Diet Free Revolution, you mention, and I quote, that diet culture is a widespread system of beliefs that equates thinness and weight loss with health, moral value, desirability, and superiority. And that diet culture is an amalgamation of systems of oppression, including but not limited to patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy. Now, I was blown away by this, and there's so much to unpack here. I would love for you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so diet culture, like I say, is a widespread system. So when we think about the system that prioritizes thinness and makes us believe that the most important thing we could do in our lives is to lose weight and aspire towards, this quote unquote, definition of health. It distracts us, and it takes up a lot of our time and energy, and makes people feel that they are less than or not good enough because they don't meet this ideal. So, it's, if we pause and think about who profits from that? Who profits from women hating their bodies? Who profits, and it's not just women, of course, but who profits, from us hating our bodies? Who profits from us believing that we need to buy these different products in order to be acceptable? Who profits from us trying to be small and, not really fully engaging in the world and taking up space? And it's these systems of oppression that have a vested interest in us believing this narrative of diet culture. So, we know that the kind of ideal body that our culture puts out as what we should all look like is a body that is white. It is, young typically. So there's ageism too. It is something, again, that we're told we can only attain through buying things. And that if we do obtain this body, we get all of this kind of privilege and luxury in life. So it's not an accident that diet culture exists or evolves. And there's a lot invested in us believing these myths that it's better to be smaller.
I completely agree with you. And the problem changes from country to country. Like with India, there is a problem with the color of your skin. There is a preconceived notion that if you're fair, then you're more desirable. And most of our products and our markets are filled with fairness creams. And that's such a problem for how a girl who doesn't belong to that complexion, it's a psychological, it makes you feel bad about yourself. And we've grown up with that. Most of the matrimonial advertisements in India say fair girl and fair girl who's educated and, things like that. So it sort of excludes you and it makes you feel terrible about yourself. And similarly with being thin, it's become such a integral part of how you are perceived from a desirability perspective. If you're not thin, you're not desirable. And that's such a strong sense of rejection for a large number of people, mostly a majority of the population in most parts of the world.
Yes.
So
and
I completely agree with you.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I think it also reinforces this narrative that we, women exist as objects, that we're there to fit this mold, to be desirable, to a partner, to be sexually alluring and attractive. And that, again, that's where our value comes from. And that's kind of the most important thing that we're told.
Yeah, and we see that in media and entertainment as well, right? The standards for women are much higher and much more harsher than it is for men. Having wrinkles is all right for a man in his 50s, but for a woman in her 50s in the media and entertainment business, she's pretty much written off. And why is it that? Why is it that, and that it's important that we have these discussions to start normalizing that sort of equality and start normalizing the fact that there are going to be different types of bodies, and healthy is going to look different on different types of bodies. So yes, I completely agree with you. And I'm glad that, there are experts like you who are having this conversation and educating people. Now, a key part of your work is about the diet culture. And despite dieting being around for decades, being a fad for decades, can you tell us why you think that diets and the diet culture has failed us, and why is it that diets don't work?
Well, I mean, diets don't work is really a matter of very basic biology. Our human body comes equipped with guidance in terms of what to eat, when to eat, how to eat. It's like, our internal appetite regulation system, things that, like our hunger, our fullness, the taste of food, what we enjoy, what we don't, how different foods react to our body. Like we have all of that hardwired within us. And diet culture kind of teaches us that we shouldn't trust any of that. It tells us that the signals that your body's sending you are wrong, that this wisdom that we're all born with is somehow not to be trusted, and that we have to try to fight against ourselves and override the natural signals coming from our body in service of trying to make ourselves smaller by following this diet plan or depriving ourselves of food. But this system, our internal appetite regulation system, evolved through eons of evolution, human evolution, literally to keep us alive, right? Like we need to eat to survive. So this system, is very well adapted at like regulating our weight and trying to help us understand like when we're hungry and sending us very strong signals to eat if we're not getting enough nutrition. And over a matter of time, a diet is always kind of a losing battle, because our body will send out signals that are stronger and stronger in an attempt to maintain some kind of equilibrium that's been disrupted through dieting. So, even the most kind of determined dieter, for the most part, eventually those signals get so strong that it's like, all we can think about is food and trying to find something to eat, and we become almost obsessed with eating. And there's actually research, like there was a research study done in, I think might have even been like the 1950s. I have to look back, but the Minnesota starvation study was one of, a very early study done, and it looked at healthy men who were abstaining from the war at the time, or they were conscientious objectors, so completely healthy men, and they deprived them of food, basically put them on like a 1,500 calorie diet. And they found that these people who had no reported issues around food or eating in the past started becoming obsessed with food. Like they were thinking about food all the time. They started, actually, the study was done at a university. They started sneaking into the library and stealing cookbooks from the university. They just wanted to talk about food all the time. So, it's a natural evolutionary kind of pushback to deprivation that we get really strong signals of needing to feed ourselves. So dieting, I think, for the most part, is designed to fail. And we know that for, upwards of like 80, depending on the research that you look at, it's like 80 to 95% of people who go on a diet don't maintain the weight loss long-term and end up gaining back the weight and don't stay on the diet plan long-term. So if we have something that we can say for up to 95% of people, is not going to be effective long-term, there's very few things that are recommended as widespread as dieting that have like a 5% effectiveness rate. And there's actually also some interesting research looking at people who are the quote unquote successful dieters. And, let's look at that 5% of people, and maybe some people can keep, stay on a diet long-term and keep the weight off, and what's going on with them. And we see that they actually have a lot in common with people struggling with chronic anorexia. And they have a lot of behaviors that are similar to people with eating disorders. So, they're not necessarily the healthiest group either.
That's fascinating. And it's interesting to me because, again, I've also grown up with a lot of diets. When I was younger, one of the diets that I heard about was a GM diet. And that was an absolutely grueling, punishing diet, which after day 3, you're bound to give up. And then you're filled with shame and self-loathing because you couldn't stick through. And then there was a military diet and all of those things that you grew up with. And finally, it came to a point where sometime in college, I had a very unhealthy relationship with food. And now it's come to a point where after a lot of healing, I don't weigh myself, and I don't have a specific diet that I look at. The only thing that I do tend to do is I do intermittent fasting a few days in a week, but I don't know how good or bad that is. It just helps me get into a more focused state because sometimes I feel a little groggy and my mind feels a little cluttered. So with intermittent fasting, I feel a little better, but that may just be purely psychological. I don't know, but that seems to be the only thing that works.
Yeah, I always tell people it's whatever, works for you and feels good for you. I mean, I do think that intermittent fasting is not so different than anything else out there. But, again, people often say like, what is a diet? How do I know if something is a diet or not? And I think that the key thing is the intention behind it. So some people, if you find that you're not hungry between certain hours, or that your body feels best, eating in a certain way, you may make choices to eat in that way. Rejecting diet culture or being anti-diet or mindful eating or intuitive eating, like none of these things mean that you have to eat everything all the time. It means that we're tuning into our body to try to understand like how our body's guiding us, and just trying to lessen the conflicts around food and make those moment by moment decisions. So, you might end up eating, types of food that look, from the outside like a diet or whatever, or you choose to eat, different ways for ethical reasons, people are vegan, or for religious reasons. But I think so much of it is about the intention and flexibility and kind of the mindset around it.
I love that, because for me, I don't have specific hours. And again, I'm bringing it back to me because that's the only point of reference I have. But I don't have specific timings. I intuitively eat when I feel like I'm hungry. So the one thing that has been the small victory for me through these years is that I've sort of taken myself out of the deprivation, punishment, and shame cycle, because I've gone through that for years. And now I finally feel like I'm not, bound by that. So this was incredibly fascinating. And the other thing that I'm coming to is the chronic problem associated with beauty standards in our society. And it's becoming more and more unrealistic. It's just so unattainable and so unrealistic that it's the comparison leads to such severe negative body image issues and self-loathing. And it's a chronic problem. It's everywhere. And it's even a child who's 13 will have access to that sort of information and that sort of content. So among so much noise of what a perfect body or what beautiful should look like, how can one find self-acceptance and self-compassion?
Yeah. So I think that this is, first of all, I want to acknowledge that this is really hard. But I think for me, and as a therapist, I found mindfulness and mindfulness-based interventions to be really powerful in terms of just starting to increase our awareness around these messages. I think the thing that's most problematic is the way that we internalize the beauty ideals, and, kind of judge ourselves by them. And this all happens in a way that's very automatic, where we often don't even realize it. We realize we don't feel good maybe, or that we're, we think about it in terms of, oh, I need to, try to lose weight, or I need to try to fix my hair some way or whatever. But like, it can be harder to kind of recognize that we're caught in this cycle of judging ourselves by these unrealistic beauty ideals. And I think that when we can start to recognize that process happening and say, oh, I'm being really hard on myself right now, or I'm, really judgmental, or who says that, my, hair has to be straight, or that my, I have to be a smaller dress size or whatever. Like, when we start to recognize where those messages are coming from, I think we can be more critical about what we're taking in. So beauty culture, diet culture, this is, for most of us, like, this is what we live in. This is the world that we're in, and we can't necessarily escape those messages, but we can start to become critical consumers of those messages and start to recognize, like, even like, for example, as a parent, I, try to like notice with my daughter, like, hey, do you notice that, all of these characters on this show look the same way, and there's no body diversity here. And in the real world, we see people whose bodies look different ways, but on the show, everybody looks very thin, or everybody looks very small. And just starting to like point that out and highlight it, I think, for kids, but for adults too, because as adults, we often uncritically take in, the fact that all of the, almost all of the movie stars look the same, look very similar in terms of a beauty ideal, or the people that we read about, in magazines or whatever. And I think that when we can start to recognize, hey, this isn't right, who's missing here, where's the representation and inclusivity and diversity, like, we can start to, again, it filters the messages that we're taking in. We're still exposed to it, but I think we internalize it in a different way.
Right. And you're right. It is difficult. It's difficult for an adult to find self-acceptance and compassion. For a child, it's going to be an uphill task. So it's important to, educate a child from the beginning, because most of the issues I feel like stem from the time that you were a child. Like, I did not have the kind of exposure to social media that children have today, and I'm glad that I did not. But even at the time, which was like the 90s, um, I was called fat, or I was called a certain complexion, and that left an impression on me up until I was an adult. And I can imagine that that would happen to children. Otherwise, very often children are impressionable, and statements like that leave a mark. So with us, it was limited to statement, and now with children who have exposure to social media, girls or boys, or persons who have exposure to social media at age 10, 11, there's so much clutter, and it's so difficult to get through that. So it is an uphill task. I think we're setting up ourselves for a bit of a challenge here. Technology is a boon, but I think one of the bigger issues with social media is particularly this of the narrative of what beautiful should look like.
And I think it goes both ways. I mean, I do think that one advantage of social media is that it has opened up a wider range of, we have slightly more control over what we see on social media, and it's opened up avenues for people of different shapes and sizes, and people who don't meet that traditional beauty ideal to put themselves out there, and that people can follow, people who do look like them, who there is more representation on social media. But we have to be very selective about what we who we follow and what we look at, and certainly what our children are looking at. And I think that I often talk to my clients about doing like a social media cleanse, where, go through and what accounts are making you feel bad about yourselves, what accounts are posting, say before and after pictures, or pictures that are emphasizing, a beauty ideal that doesn't resonate for you, or any beauty ideal for that matter, and just unfollow, and then to try to follow accounts that are more geared towards body positivity or recovery. If you're in eating disorder recovery, those kinds of things can be really powerful, because we know that representation does matter, and that what we see makes an impact, and that when we see people who look like us, and people in different types of bodies, and especially people in larger bodies, and people with darker skin, and people of color, like when we see that every day in our feeds, it starts to recognize that these people are out there living their lives with joy, and we don't have to wait until we meet some impossible ideal that really was never designed to us in the first place to be living our lives.
Yeah, I agree. I love that you said that we need to become critical consumers of the content that we, view. Thank you. Thank you for that. And the other important thing that even I've personally been struggling with is that, the pandemic has nearly been around for 2 years now. We don't know how long it's going to stick around. And we're going in and out of lockdown, and one of the major issues with lockdown is that a lot of us are struggling with emotional eating. Now, emotional eating generally has a negative connotation, so it'll be interesting to have your perspective on emotional eating. You speak about it in your book in great depth, but can you tell us more about emotional eating, and how can we cope with it?
So, I like to start off by saying that I don't think that emotional eating is always bad. I think that it's been very much kind of villainized, and that goes along with diet culture and this idea that we should, be eating as little as possible to make ourselves as small as possible. I think when we think about it, emotional eating can be a very effective and valid way to cope with our feelings. If people are feeling really overwhelmed and eating something helps them feel better and gets them through a difficult moment, I really don't think there's anything wrong with that. And when we think about the, range of things that people do to cope, it's really not the worst thing that could happen. And, but I do think that emotional eating can feel problematic for people, especially when it's the only thing that they know to turn to. So, there's no one coping mechanism that's going to help get us through every moment. And I think that whatever it is that we're turning to, whether it's food or anything else, it can, be good. It can be helpful and useful in certain moments. But when it's the only thing that we have and we turn to the same thing over and over again, it just doesn't always effectively meet our needs. And at the end of the day, our emotions are important messengers, and they're coming to tell us something, and kind of wanting to be heard and dealt with. So if we're constantly kind of pushing away our feelings and never really paying attention to them, that can, cause kind of, we could say like an emotional blockage, or we're just not properly tending to our emotional needs. So I talk out, like you said, at length in the book, and also in my online course. We talk a lot about what to do with emotional eating, but I think that the most important thing is that it be a choice, and that the option to eat emotionally is always there, and that's always one option. And then what other options and tools do we have to deal with our emotions? Because there might be moments where what you really need is to eat a cookie, and that's going to help you feel better and, move along. And there's sometimes that you might need to call a friend and talk it out, or see a therapist and get some professional mental health interventions too, because some of these things can be more persistent depression or anxiety or things like that warrant professional attention.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because there's a strong stigma associated with therapy in India. A lot of people, I'm glad that it's become more acceptable in Western countries, but in India, it still continues to be a stigma. And if you're going to a therapist, it's perceived as you being crazy. So there's a lot of secrecy and shame around it. And, even therapists struggle with that sort of, bringing issues to the forefront, which are important. So the fact that sometimes some people are emotional eating, or we're emotional eating, is probably stemming from something entirely different, which could probably be rectified through professional care. And I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think therapy is really important. And if you're struggling with, for example, like sadness that doesn't go away over a prolonged period of time, or, a pervasive sense of worry, or other things that feel like they're taking up a lot of space in your mind, it really is helpful. And my view on therapy is that we all could benefit from therapy, and it doesn't have to be that you're at the lowest point possible, or that you're struggling with like severe mental illness, although obviously many people do, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But most of us could use a little help. And, I hope that conversations like this will kind of break through some of the stigma around therapy, because I do think it can be such a important resource. And I'll say, just circling back briefly to emotional eating, I think that it can be a way to cope with more serious emotional issues, but it's also, again, a normal part of healthy eating. I think that we all eat emotionally at times. If we think about celebrating a birthday with a piece of cake, or feeling sad or nervous and, going to a bag of chips or something, like even people who have, the, quote unquote healthiest relationship with food, those things are normal. So I do think that we have to allow, space for it to exist. But if it feels problematic, that's something to look at too.
I agree. And thank you for that. And particularly with human beings, our life revolves around food in a good way. I personally believe that food is something that ties us together. It's so culturally ingrained, and it's such an integral part of our society for all of cataloged history. So it's an important thing to be celebrated, rather than to be, constantly having a sense of punishment and deprivation around it. So yes, I completely agree with you. And the therapy part is something that even I needed to hear. So thank you for that. So I know in your book, The Dietary Revolution, that you emphasize on the importance of meditation and mindfulness to develop a healthy association with food and eating. So can you talk to us about that as well?
Yeah. So mindfulness is, one of the most important things that I have found in my practice to help us shift not only our relationship with food, but really fundamentally our relationship with ourselves. I think that when we can practice mindfulness meditation, it starts to strengthen the parts of our brain that are dedicated to increasing awareness and increasing kind of just our recognition of what's happening in the present moment. And so much of life goes by where we're tuned out and we're really kind of not present. And we can't do anything if we can't change anything if we're not aware of what's going on. So to me, that's really the first step, is just trying to increase awareness. Like I said, even whether it's of the information we're taking in terms of the messages from diet culture or beauty culture, or the messages, being more aware of the message that our own body is sending us in terms of if we're hungry and what types of foods we want to eat, and also the messages that our mind is sending us in terms of what we're feeling and, what kinds of emotions are calling our attention at each moment. I think that mindfulness just really, opens up space to look more curiously at all of that.
I'm glad you mentioned the physiological effect that mindfulness has. I was personally blown away by the fact that meditation can actually change your brain from a neurochemical and physical standpoint. And, it's not just a woo-woo spiritual thing. Obviously, that too has its benefit, and everybody has, different ways of living their life. But from a purely scientific, physiological perspective, it has tremendous benefits. And it's I hear you when meditation can have a direct correlation to the kind of relationship that you have with food, and your book beautifully explains that. I recommend it to everybody, and it's available in Amazon in India, right? If I want to buy a hard copy of that, I can buy it on Amazon or on Kindle in India.
I believe so. If not, you might have to go through the US Amazon, but I would have to look into that a little bit more with my publisher. I know I published with a small publisher. It's a small nonprofit, and it unfortunately, it doesn't have the global reach I wish that it did. But any publishers out there in India who want to publish a version there, contact us.
That would be fantastic. But your Instagram page and your Twitter page also are extremely insightful. So I would recommend people to go to that. Also, we're going to be linking your Instagram page on our description box. I now come to the next question, which I'm personally, again, very passionate about, is that in your work, you draw a clear distinction between being healthy and being thin. And this distinction, according to me, is critical because of the preconceived, societal bias that these two are intrinsically linked to each other. So can you talk to us about that? And can you give us 4 healthy behaviors that one should aspire to have that are not typically associated with being thin or with weight loss?
Yeah. So, I think that there's been a lot of conflating between the idea of thinness and weight loss and health. And we really have been taught that the way to achieve health is to lose weight. And when we look at the data, that really doesn't support that. And what we find, again, when we come from the perspective that weight it's not a behavior. It's not something that is so under our control. It's determined by a number of different factors, largely genetics. And that when we do try to manipulate our weight, what we see over the long term, if we look at the research, over 10 or 15 years, is that people who are dieting and trying to lose weight tend to lose weight and then regain it and then lose and regain. And this is called weight cycling. And we know that that can have a negative impact on our health as well, because it's stressing the body to be going up and down, and it disrupts our metabolism and other processes as well. Remember, the body likes homeostasis. Like our body wants to know that things are stable, that we have enough food, that we are in a routine, we're not in imminent danger, there's no famine around the corner. And when our body thinks that something is wrong, everything kind of goes out of whack a little bit. So what we see when we look at the research is that a lot of the things that impact health, well, first of all, are things that aren't so under our control. So we know that weight stigma has a big impact on our health. So when we look at the data that's showing, well, people in a larger body are having worse health outcomes, it's not factoring in the fact that these are also people who are experiencing widespread discrimination, who often, at least in the US, have difficulty accessing competent medical care. They're less likely to go to the doctors for preventative medical care because their experiences with the doctors are so negative. They kind of go into the doctor's office and they're told, well, you just have to lose weight, and often shamed and given, very disrespectful conversations. So that's one thing that we know that impacts health. So when we look at the data, we can start to tease apart, is it really weight that's determining our health, or could it be these other factors? We also know, again, and this is data, I believe, in the US, that that income is like one of the biggest predictors for health. So the wealthier you are, the longer that you're going to live. And that happens all across the spectrum. So not only in comparing the poorest people with the most wealthy people, but the most wealthy people with the slightly less wealthy people, like the most wealthy, are always going to live longer. So all these things, are kind of outside of our control. And then of course, like I said, genetics is by and far the largest predictor of our health. So a lot of the times when we think about health, we think about personal responsibility, and this kind of, if you're sick, it's your fault, or you're not doing enough to work on your health. But a lot of our health is just kind of luck of the draw and outside of our control. But we also know that there are things that we can do to impact our health or improve our health that are completely separate from weight. So, and these are things that are in our control, they're behaviors, and the research shows that they have an impact on improving health completely separate from BMI, from our weight. So when we look at things, some of the health behaviors that kind of pan out again and again in research are things like eating more fruits and vegetables, getting adequate sleep, not smoking cigarettes, not drinking alcohol in excess. Social connections is another big one that's often not spoken about. We know that loneliness and isolation, something a lot of people have been coping with throughout the pandemic, is, has, I believe it's almost an equivalent impact on health as smoking.
Wow.
Yeah. So, these are the kinds of things that we can focus on, and physical activity. So moving your body in a way that feels enjoyable. It doesn't have to be, like the most intense form of physical activity, but being active in some way we know can improve our health. And the other thing I want to highlight is that I really believe that everybody's health is improved if we can kind of be respectful and move away from, stigmatizing and marginalizing people. And, nobody has to, engage in these behaviors if you don't want to. These are things that we can think about if you want to improve our health. But even people who smoke, or people who are not active, it doesn't mean, it's not a moral assessment. It doesn't mean that they aren't deserving of respect and being treated with basic human dignity, which is something we forget a lot.
Absolutely. Being non-judgmental is very important. We're very quick to judge somebody else's, lifestyle choices, and we don't really look within, and we fail to introspect that what is it that I could probably do to, improve my life, and how can I be respectful to somebody else's choices. So the key pointers that you mentioned were eating fruits and vegetables, sleeping, avoiding cigarettes and alcohol, social connection, and physical activity. And would you add sunlight exposure to that as well? Because this is something that I learned through the Huberman Lab podcast. So is that something that you would add? Is that something that you think is relevant?
Yeah, I haven't, it's not something that came up again in the research that I saw. A lot of these, there were a lot of large studies that kind of identified those factors. And I want to just emphasize, it doesn't have to be avoiding alcohol completely, but and not drinking in excess is the key thing.
Got it.
But from a psychological perspective, I think sunlight's very important. And, I think that especially like right now in New York, where it's cold and dark, and people are, kind of more isolated, especially because of COVID, that has an impact on our mental health for sure.
Absolutely. I lived in London for my master's for about a year, and I was pretty miserable through the winters. I've lived in a tropical country my entire life. India is always known to be sunny summers or winters. So for me, suddenly seeing sunset at 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon was terrible. So
yeah,
great. Thank you. Thank you so much for those pointers. Those are very, very key takeaways. I'd like to end with a question that I ask all of my guests. What, according to you, does it take to be a resolute woman?
So I think one of the most important things is working on self-acceptance. I think that if we can accept ourselves and start to free ourselves from the shame cycle, it really empowers us to be able to engage more fully in the world and just be able to put ourselves out there in a different way. You know, when we feel that we're not good enough and we don't accept ourselves and we're harsh and critical towards ourselves, we do become small. You know, we don't want to have our voices heard. We don't want to put ourselves out there because we feel like we're not deserving or we're not good enough to do that. So I think, you know, if we can work on accepting ourselves as we are and recognizing that we are good enough at this very moment, that can create a big shift.
I love that, and I try to practice that. I'm very critical of myself, so that's very important to me, and I'm sure that's going to be very important to the people who are listening to this. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Dr. Alexis. I appreciate you and the work that you do greatly. Keep inspiring and stay resolute.
Thank you so much.
I hope you liked this episode. For more content to empower your mindset, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and do share this with the resolute women in your life. So take care and bye-bye.